Picture a river barge sitting on dry land, 30 feet above the green river, its hull pointing skyward like the belly of some great beached creature. Two people stand beneath it in the rain, looking up. They are not salvaging it. They are not selling it. They are moving into it. This is how Jonas and Sadie Whitlock began their marriage. Spring came early to the Green River country in 1879, and it came mean. The old freighters and the ferry operators along that stretch of the Wyoming Territory had a saying they'd repeat whenever a newcomer arrived with bright eyes and a loaded wagon. A river gives and a river takes, and what it leaves behind is never what you expected. Jonas Whitlock had heard that saying once. He was about to learn exactly what it meant, and Jonas Whitlock had spent the better part of his 20s doing work that used his back more than his name. He'd hauled freight out of Salt Lake, driven mule teams across the Wasatch, and spent 2 seasons as a deckhand on the flat-bottomed trade barges that worked the Green River between the railroad spur at Green River Station and the military supply contracts up near Fort Bridger. He knew rope. He knew timber. He knew the particular way wetwood smells when it's been soaked through one too many seasons. He was not a man of many words, but he was a man of considerable observation. Sadie, born Sadie Crane, in a small Nebraska town near the Platte, had grown up watching her mother turn almost nothing into almost enough. She had learned to read weather, preserve anything that could be preserved, and look at a broken thing with genuine curiosity rather than despair. She kept a small journal, not of feelings exactly, but of practical observations. How long it took beans to soften in high altitude, the best angle to bank a fire for overnight warmth, which wild plants along a riverbank were worth knowing. She was the kind of woman who noticed things, and who remembered what she noticed. They had married in late February of 1879, in a brief ceremony in Evanston, Wyoming Territory, with a circuit preacher and 2 borrowed witnesses. They had $31 between them, a good mule named Cooter, a wagon loaded with reasonable supplies, and a letter. The letter had arrived 2 months earlier, written in the careful hand of a county clerk in Uinta County. It informed Jonas that his great-uncle Reuben Whitlock, formerly a river trader, an occasional ferryman along the Green, had died the previous autumn and had left his property, described as a cabin, outbuildings, and a freight barge, situated on a parcel of land near the river, some miles west of Fort Bridger, to Jonas, his only traceable relation. Jonas had read the letter 3 times. Then he had read it to Sadie. She had said, "Well, let's go see what we have." They arrived on a Tuesday in late March, after 2 days on the road from Evanston. The cabin was there. That much was true. It sat on a low bench of ground above the river, sheltered on the north by a stand of cottonwoods still bare from winter, the Green sliding past maybe 80 yards below, pewter-colored and swollen with snowmelt. The view was, Jonas admitted, genuinely fine. The roof was not. 3 of the 4 main rafters had failed. The ridgeline sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. Half the shake shingles had either rotted through or blown away entirely, and what remained let in enough sky that Sadie, standing in the doorway, could identify 2 distinct cloud formations without removing her hat. She did not cry. She stood there a moment and then said, "Show me the barge." The barge was downstream of the cabin, resting on its side against a gravel bar where a bend in the river had deposited it, probably during some high water year, and left it there to season in the sun and weather. It was roughly 30 feet long and 12 feet wide, built from thick cottonwood planks over a frame of hewn green oak timber. River barges of that era were built to be punished, and Reuben's barge had been punished thoroughly, but the hull planking was still largely sound. Jonas walked every inch of it, pressing his thumb into the wood at intervals the way a man checks a melon. He knocked on the planking with his knuckle. He stood back and looked at it. Sadie stood beside him and looked at it too. "We cannot afford lumber," Jonas said. "Not enough to re-roof. Not before the storms come in." The sky to the southwest had been building for 2 days. Anyone who had spent time in the Wyoming Territory in late March knew that particular color of yellow-gray on the horizon. It was not a sky that was willing to wait. "How much would proper lumber cost?" Sadie asked. "More than we have. The nearest mill is at the railroad, and freight rates on top of that." He paused. "Even if we had it, in green lumber on an old frame in a spring wind is a bad combination." Sadie looked at the barge again. She had her arms folded, and she was doing what Jonas had already come to recognize as her thinking expression. Eyes slightly narrowed, lips pressed together, perfectly still. "The hull is curved," she said. "Yes. Water runs off a curve." He looked at her. "You're thinking upside down," he said. "I'm thinking about what we have," she said, "which is a roof-shaped object and a cabin with no roof." Jonas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the barge. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the distance between them, which was perhaps 200 yards of uneven, muddy, root-threaded ground. "That hull weighs close to 1,000 pounds, he said. "I know," said Sadie, "so we'd better start thinking." They agreed that evening, sitting on upturned crates inside the roofless cabin, with a lantern between them and the clouds pressing lower from the southwest. They would not wait for lumber they could not afford. They would not patch what could not be patched. They would take the barge hull, flip it, move it, and seat it over the cabin walls as a roof. It was, Jonas said, either the most sensible thing he had ever heard or the most foolish, and he was not entirely sure which. Sadie poured him a cup of coffee from the pot she had balanced over the fire and said it was probably both, and that they should start at first light. The nearest neighbor was a man named Orville Peck, who ran a small ferry crossing 2 miles downriver and had apparently known Reuben Whitlock well enough to attend the informal burial. He appeared at the edge of their property the next morning, leading a mule and carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder, as if he had already heard the plan and found it interesting enough to investigate in person. He looked at the barge. He looked at the cabin. He scratched the back of his neck. "I've got a block and tackle," he said, "and nothing pressing until Thursday." Orville Peck turned out to be one of those practical, quietly indispensable men that frontier communities produced regularly and never fully appreciated. He was 53, with large, calloused hands, a slow manner of speaking, and the particular patience of a man who had spent decades moving heavy objects across difficult ground. He had operated his ferry for 11 years and knew the Green River's moods, its seasonal flooding patterns, the way its banks shifted, and the angle at which the bench of ground above the cabin would drain in a hard rain. He also knew how Reuben Whitlock had come to own the barge. Reuben ran freight from the railroad spur down to the fort for about 8 years, Orville told them that first morning, while Jonas was walking the ground between the barge and the cabin and Sadie was making a sketch in her journal. He was a methodical man, kept good accounts, made a reasonable living until the Army changed its supply contract and cut out the independent freighters. After that, he just stayed, couldn't bear to leave the river. The barge had been Reuben's last working vessel. When the contracts dried up, he had dragged it above the spring flood line with the help of 2 neighboring men and a team of horses, intending to repair it and sell it. He never did. He built the cabin instead, living aboard the barge through one summer while the cabin walls went up, and then simply left the barge where it sat. Knowing this gave Jonas a strange feeling of respect for the old man he had never met. The barge had been a home once already. Perhaps it was willing to become one again. The first day's work was entirely preparation. Jonas walked the route twice, marking the worst obstacles with stakes: a buried root mass near the cottonwoods, a low soft spot where spring seepage had turned the ground to paste, and a slight rise in the terrain midway that would require the load to go uphill for about 30 feet before descending to the cabin level. Orville walked it with him, saying little, but twice stopping to redirect the proposed line slightly, each time explaining his reasoning in a sentence or two that demonstrated he had moved heavy things across terrain before. Sadie spent the morning inside the cabin, doing work that Jonas had not yet thought of. She measured the cabin walls carefully with a knotted length of cord, recording the dimensions in her journal. She checked the tops of the walls, built of stacked cottonwood logs, for level, using a small amount of water in a tin pan, watching which way it slid. She found that the south wall was 3 inches lower than the north. She reported this to Jonas at midday, along with a diagram she had drawn showing how the barge, if seated correctly, would need to be shimmed on the south side with flat stones to sit plumb. Jonas looked at her diagram for a long moment. "How did you think to check that?" he asked. "My father's barn floor was uneven," she said. "We spent 6 years wondering why the grain bins leaked on one side." They cut greased skids from saplings along the riverbank that afternoon, splitting them flat on one side and driving them into the ground at intervals along the route to give the barge something smooth to slide across. The grease was tallow from their supply stores, and they used more of it than Jonas had intended, but Orville assured him it was the right amount, and that a man who undergreased a skid path generally regretted it before he reached the end. By late afternoon, they had the skid path established, 2 anchor posts driven deeply into the ground on either side of the barge for the block and tackle, and a preliminary rope harness rigged around the hull. The 3 of them stood back and looked at their work as the light went amber over the river. The barge had not moved yet, but everything was ready for it to move. Sadie said it looked like the beginning of something, and she meant it as a good thing. The moving began on the second morning. Orville's block and tackle system was a simple but powerful arrangement, a rope threaded through a series of pulleys that multiplied the pulling force considerably, allowing 3 people, and at critical moments, Orville's mule and Jonas's mule Cooter working in tandem, to move a load that no 3 people could have shifted directly. The barge was not on wheels. It was on the greased skids, and the principle was that once it began moving, momentum would do part of the work. The first pull took everything they had. Jonas leaned into the rope with his full weight, Sadie pulling beside him, Orville managing the lead line to the mule team and calling the cadence. The barge groaned. It shifted a half inch, then another. Then, with a long, ugly scraping sound and a shudder that Jonas felt through his boots, it came free of the gravel bar it had been resting against for years and began slowly to move. It took the entire morning to move it 50 feet. The soft spot Jonas had marked with a stake nearly ended everything. The front corner of the barge sank into the spring seepage, and the whole load canted sideways with a stomach-dropping lurch. Orville called a halt immediately. They spent the better part of an hour laying a corduroy of cut branches under the soft section, packing them tight and covering them with the driest dirt they could find from higher ground. When they tried again, the barge crossed the soft spot on its improvised bridge and came out the other side level. Sadie did not stop moving the entire time. While Jonas and Orville managed the ropes and the mules, she was continuously ahead of the barge, repositioning displaced skids, re-greasing sections that had picked up dry dirt, and watching the angle of the hull with the focused attention of someone managing a live situation. She had never done anything like this before, but she had an instinct for what the barge needed at each moment that Jonas noticed and did not comment on, knowing that commenting would only slow her down. By midday, the barge was past the rise and beginning the slight descent toward the cabin. This was both easier and more dangerous. Gravity helped, but it also meant the load wanted to move faster than they could safely control. Orville had anticipated this and had rigged a brake line, a separate rope anchored to a stout cottonwood uphill, that he managed to keep tension on as the barge crept downward. Twice the barge accelerated against his preference, and twice Orville applied the brake with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen runaway loads before and had strong opinions about them. They stopped for a midday meal of cold biscuits, dried meat, and water from the river. No one talked much. The cabin was visible from where they sat, maybe 60 feet away. The barge sat on the slope between them and it. Sadie was looking at the cabin walls. "We'll need to notch the top logs," she said, "on the north and south walls, to seat the barge frame. Otherwise it'll want to shift in a wind." Jonas and Orville both looked at the walls, then at her. "You figured the seat angle?" Orville asked. "I have it in the journal." After the meal, Jonas climbed the cabin walls with a hand axe and cut the notches she had specified while the barge waited on the slope. The cottonwood logs were old and dry, and the notching went quickly. He tested the depth twice with a stick cut to Sadie's measurements and adjusted the second pair of notches slightly deeper on her direction. By late afternoon, they had the barge at the base of the cabin walls, and the hull was upside down now. They had flipped it earlier using the block and tackle and a pivot point Orville had rigged, its flat bottom facing the sky and its curved hull pointing downward, the shape of it shedding imaginary rain. Tomorrow, they would lift it. That evening, Orville stayed for supper. Sadie made cornmeal porridge with dried apple and the last of their salt pork, and they ate it by the fire in the open-walled cabin, under a sky that had turned the particular color of old pewter that precedes a significant storm. Orville looked at the sky for a long while after supper. 2 days, he said, maybe less. No one argued with him. He had watched the Green River's weather for 11 years, and he was not a man who said things without reason. Jonas looked at the hull sitting 10 feet away. Sadie looked at the walls, and they had 1 day to finish. The lifting began before full light. Jonas had spent part of the previous evening rigging the lift, working by lantern light, while Sadie organized their remaining supplies and moved everything that could be damaged by rain to the driest corner of the cabin. He had built 4 lifting rigs, 2 on the long walls, 1 at each gable end, using forked poles set into the ground at an angle, and a second set of ropes threaded through the blocks to give vertical pull. Orville had checked each rig before he turned in, adjusting 1 anchor stake he felt wasn't set deep enough and adding a secondary line to the east gable that Jonas had not thought to include. The lifting itself had to be managed at all 4 points simultaneously. An uneven lift would torque the hull and potentially split the old planking, or worse, to bring the whole load down sideways. Jonas assigned the stations, himself at the west long wall, Sadie at the east, Orville at the south gable, and Orville's mule, managed by a lead tied to the post at the north gable, providing the 4th pull point. The mule was more reliable than a 4th person, Orville said, because it did not get excited. The sky was the color of a bruised peach in the east when they began. The wind was already from the southwest. Jonas could smell the rain in it. They pulled on Orville's count. The first foot of lift was the worst. The hull was resting on the tops of the cabin walls, and it had to be lifted free of the notches Sadie had specified before it could be moved laterally into final position. For 3 terrible minutes, the ropes sang under tension, and nothing happened. Jonas felt the rope burning through his gloves and leaned until his boots were skating in the mud. Then the hull broke free. It rose slowly, tilting slightly toward the east. Sadie applied more tension on her side without being told, and then leveled. 6 inches off the walls, a foot, 2 feet, enough. Orville called the halt. They held the load while Orville walked the perimeter at a half run, checking the clearance at each wall, adjusting the angle of one of the forked pole lifters with a quick kick of his boot, and then returning to his station. "She's straight," he said. "Come down easy and seat it." The lowering was slower than the lifting. Jonas paid out his rope an inch at a time, watching the hull descend toward the wall tops. He could see Sadie across the opening, her face concentrated, her rope between both hands, letting it down with the particular care of a person handling something that cannot be dropped. The south gable seated first, dropping into the notches Jonas had cut with a solidity that he felt rather than heard. Then the north. Then the long walls, both sides settling simultaneously into their notches with a heavy wooden knock that scattered a pair of nesting kingfishers from the cottonwoods. Jonas let out a breath he had been holding for a long time. The hull sat on the cabin. It sat as Sadie had designed it to sit, the curve running north to south, shedding rain to both sides, the flat underside of the hull forming the new ceiling of the room below. The old caulking between the hull planks was dry but largely intact. The overlap at the wall tops was 14 inches on each side, enough to protect the log walls from direct rain. They stood back and looked at it. The cloud line was now clearly visible to the southwest, dark and continuous, maybe 15 miles out. Orville put his hands on his hips and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That'll hold." The storm arrived in the late afternoon. They spent the hours between the seating of the hull and the first rain doing the work that would determine whether the roof survived the night or simply became an expensive failure. Jonas went up onto the hull with a bucket of hot pine pitch Sadie had rendered from knotwood she had gathered that morning, and he sealed every joint he could reach. The notch seats, the contact points with the wall logs, 2 cracks in the old caulking near the south gable that he found by running his palm across the planking and feeling the cold air moving through them. The pitch smelled sharp and good, and it set quickly in the cooling air. Sadie worked below him, were inside the cabin, doing something Jonas had not yet thought of again. She was driving small wooden wedges, cut from the sapling trimmings, up into the gap between the underside of the hull and the tops of the cabin walls, tapping them tight with the back of a hatchet, sealing the interior from wind. She moved along all 4 walls methodically, wedge by wedge, humming to herself, occasionally calling up to Jonas that she could still see light through a particular section, and would he check the pitch on that joint? He checked each one she identified. She was right every time. Orville spent the afternoon cutting and fitting 4 brace poles, heavy saplings sharpened at both ends, bracing them diagonally between the base of each wall and the hull above, adding lateral resistance against the wind loading the coming storm, would put on the curved surface. They were inelegant but solid, and he drove the lower ends into notches in the wall logs with the unhurried precision of a man who has built things before and knows the difference between adequate and sufficient. The first drops came as Jonas was climbing down from the hull. They hit the curved planking with a sound that was neither the drumming of rain on shingles nor the hammering of rain on a flat surface, but something in between, a rolling, continuous percussion that moved across the curve as the angle of the rain shifted. It was oddly musical. Inside the cabin, they stood and listened. The rain came harder. The sound intensified. Jonas watched a drop form at one of the wedged wall joints, collect, and roll down the inside wall log. Not a leak, just the cold of the log pulling condensation, which Sadie identified immediately and addressed by repositioning a piece of oilcloth against that section of wall. No water came through the hull. Orville sat on his crate and drank the coffee Sadie had produced from somewhere and watched the new ceiling with the expression of a man taking a professional inventory. Reuben used white oak for the frame, he said, and the planking is cottonwood, but it's old-growth cottonwood, tight grain. That's why it's still sound. The wind hit shortly after dark. It came from the southwest as predicted, and it hit the curved hull with a sustained force that rattled the brace poles and shook the cottonwoods outside, and inside the cabin the lantern flame bent and steadied, and the roof held. Jonas sat on the floor of his cabin, their cabin, with his back against the north wall and his knees up, listening to the storm displace itself around the curve above him. Sadie sat close beside him. The fire in the hearth threw light against the underside of the old hull, catching the grain of the cottonwood planks, and Jonas thought that it looked, improbably, like the inside of a ship in a safe harbor. Which was, in a way, exactly what it was. But in the early hours before dawn, something gave. Jonas woke to a sound, not the storm, which had settled into a steady, serious rain, but something beneath it, a low, splintering crack from somewhere in the structure above him. He sat up and listened. Sadie was already awake beside him, still, her eyes open in the dark. They heard it again. He rose and lifted the lantern. He moved along the wall, holding the light up to the hull joints. At the northeast corner, the brace pole Orville had set had shifted, and the hull had separated from the wall notch by 3/4 of an inch. A thin, dark line of open sky. Jonas stood in the rain-dark cabin holding the lantern, and he felt the full weight of the past 3 days settle on him at once. The aching in his shoulders and hands, the money they had spent on tallow and pitch and supplies, the marriage they had tried to begin here, in this unlikely place, with this unlikely plan, the small, foolish, stubborn hope that the two of them could take a dead man's barge and a fallen-down cabin and make it into something worth living in. He set the lantern on its hook and put both hands on the shifted brace pole. It was not broken. The lower end had rotated in its notch, driven sideways by the wind load on the curve. He held it and thought. Sadie was beside him. "Can it be reset?" she asked. He moved the lantern close to the joint. The notch in the wall log was still intact. The brace end was still whole. It had not failed. It had moved. There was a difference. "I need a wedge," he said. "A thick one." She went to the pile of sapling offcuts without another word and came back with 3 candidates. He chose the widest, and he drove it tight beside the brace foot with the back of the hatchet, locking the rotation. He held his breath. The splintering sound did not come again. He checked every other brace before he allowed himself to believe the crisis was past. 2 more had shifted fractionally. He wedged both. He moved along all 4 wall joints with the lantern and pressed his thumb into each one, checking the separation. The northeast corner was the worst. Every other joint was still seated. By the time he had finished the circuit, the rain outside was lessening, not stopping, but pulling back to a steady, even rhythm without the violent gusts that had driven in from the southwest. Sadie was already putting more wood on the fire. Dawn came gray and wet and new. The rain had settled by first light into a fine, persistent drizzle, the kind that would continue most of the morning and leave everything coated in a thin layer of moisture, but the wind was gone entirely. Jonas stepped outside into it and stood looking at the hull from beneath the overhang of the eaves. The pine pitch joints gleamed dark. The curve ran clean from north gable to south gable, shedding the drizzle in two thin rivulets that ran off the wall logs and disappeared into the mud below. Orville appeared from the direction of the river about an hour after daybreak, leading his mule. He stopped when he saw the hull and looked at it for a long moment from the edge of the clearing. Then he walked up to the cabin and ran his hand along the south wall, checking the overhang, pressing his fingers against the pitch-sealed notch joint. He turned to Jonas. "How'd she do?" "We had a brace shift in the night," Jonas said. "Northeast corner. I reset it." Orville nodded slowly. He walked to the northeast corner and looked at the wedge Jonas had driven. He pressed it with his thumb. "I should have driven that one deeper," he said. "I knew it when I set it, and I talked myself out of going back for the longer stake. It held, because you were awake to fix it." They stood together looking at the corner for a moment, two men sharing the particular form of professional respect that forms between people who have worked hard on something difficult together. "I want to add a second brace at each corner before the next storm," Jonas said. "Cross-braced. I was thinking iron rod if I can get it from the smithy at the fort." Orville considered this. "You could do it with heavy timber if the rod is dear. Mortised. Takes longer, but it costs less. Show me the joint you have in mind." They spent an hour at the corner working through the engineering of it, drawing in the mud with a stick, agreeing on dimensions. It was the kind of conversation Jonas had not had since his freight days, when the problem was always specific and the solution had to be both practical and honest. He felt, standing in the drizzle with Orville, that he had found someone worth knowing. Inside the cabin, Sadie had been busy since first light, in the way she was always busy. Not dramatically, but completely. She had swept the dirt floor, arranged their supplies on the shelves Jonas had roughed in along the west wall, hung their coats on the iron hooks by the door, and set the small iron cook stove to work on a proper breakfast. Fried cornmeal with the remainder of the salt pork and a pot of coffee strong enough to drive nails. She had also, Jonas noticed when he came inside, done something else. She had tacked a piece of brown paper to the underside of the hull, the ceiling of their cabin, and written on it in her careful hand, "Whitlock, March 1879. Just that, the name and the date. He looked at it for a moment. "Seemed right to sign it," she said. He didn't say anything. He poured his coffee and sat down on the bench she had placed near the stove. Through the spring and into the summer, the hull proved itself in every weather the Wyoming territory offered. A late April snow fell 6 inches overnight and slid clean off the curve by morning. A June thunderstorm with hail drove Orville's ferry team to shelter, but inside the Whitlock cabin, the hailstones merely rattled against the hull like river pebbles against a boat, which was, after all, exactly what they were striking. On the cottonwood planking absorbed the sound the way old wood does, with a low resonance rather than a sharp clatter. Jonas added the cross braces in May, using mortised hardwood as Orville had suggested. He fitted river stone chinking along the base of the hull where it met the wall logs, pressing it in with a mix of clay and straw that Sadie had prepared to the right consistency after 3 test batches. He put in a proper door, salvaged from the best boards of the collapsed original roof timbers, planed flat and hung true. He built a sleeping loft in the north end, accessed by a ladder of river pole rungs. Sadie put in a kitchen garden on the east side, where the afternoon light ran long. She started seeds in the cabin's south window in April, and transplanted them when the frosts had passed into working the dark river-bottom soil with a short-handled spade and the patient energy of a person who believes in the future of what she is planting. Orville came by regularly, sometimes with his wife Marvella, who brought opinions about kitchen arrangements and the correct way to preserve river fish, and an assessment of Sadie's garden that was both critical and complimentary in roughly equal measure. Sadie received both parts with equal grace. In late summer, a passing wagon train paused at the river crossing, and two of the men in it walked up to examine the strange roof, unable to figure from the road what they were seeing. Jonas let them look. One of them, a former carpenter from Ohio, each walked the perimeter twice and then stood back and said he had never seen its like and couldn't say whether it was the worst house he had ever seen or the most sensible, and Jonas told him that he knew exactly what he meant. People along that stretch of the Green River came to call it the Barge House. The name stuck with the fondness that unusual things sometimes earn when they work reliably in a hard country, and it worked. Every season it worked. Years later, on an evening in a season they had stopped trying to count, Jonas stood outside the cabin in the long light of a summer dusk, watching the river move past below. The hull above him had weathered to the same silver gray as old driftwood, its curve soft against the sky. Sadie came out and stood beside him. From the road, a stranger might have looked up and wondered what kind of people would live beneath such a thing. The kind, Jonas might have told them, who looked at what they had and decided it was enough to start with. The river moved past. The barge roof held. The light fell clean across everything they had made.